The messages stop first, not all at once, but in a way that feels deliberate, like watching someone slowly close a door. You send a text. It shows as read. Hours pass, then days. The silence grows heavier, with each passing moment filling the space where conversation used to live. You call, and the phone rings into emptiness. You check their social media, scrolling through the absence of new posts, new updates, new signs of life. From where you stand, it looks like abandonment. It feels like rejection. The questions arrive uninvited. Did I say something wrong? Did I push too hard? Why won't they let me in? But if you could step through the screen, through the walls, through the careful architecture of their withdrawal, you would see something entirely different. You would see them curled beneath blankets in the middle of the afternoon, curtains drawn against daylight that feels too bright, too demanding. You would see their phone face down on the nightstand, notifications piling up like snow against a closed door. You would hear the refrigerator's hum, the only sound in an apartment gone still. You would feel the weight pressing down on their chest, not metaphorical, but physical, as real as gravity. The world outside has become impossible to navigate. Every interaction feels like lifting something too heavy. Every conversation requires energy they no longer possess. So they retreat, not away from you, but into something older, something that lives beneath language and logic. They are building a cave brick by brick, each one laid with trembling hands. They are curling inward like a wounded animal instinct, overriding everything else. They are searching for darkness and silence the way lungs search for air. This is not about you. This is about survival. The sadness that arrived wasn't gentle. It came like a flood, rising through the floorboards of consciousness, filling every room until there was nowhere left to stand. And in that moment, when the water reached their throat, they didn't reach out for help. They didn't call your name. Instead, they dove down, searching for someplace deeper, someplace hidden, someplace where the flood couldn't follow. They went looking for a cave. This is the paradox that lives at the heart of human grief. Sadness is universal, woven into the fabric of every life, yet it activates something ancient and isolating. It makes connection feel like danger. It transforms the embrace of a friend into something suffocating, something to escape. The vulnerability that should draw us together instead drives us apart, sending us back to some primordial understanding that wounds must be hidden, that weakness must be concealed, that suffering is something to face alone in the dark. But why? Why does one of our most shared experiences trigger such profound withdrawal? Why does the instinct to hide feel safer than the instinct to seek comfort? Why do the people who care about us the most suddenly feel like threats when we need them the most? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't the same for everyone. But it lives somewhere in the intersection of biology and memory, instinct and experience, the animal body we inherited, and the stories we've been told about what sadness means. It lives in childhood bedrooms where tears were met with irritation instead of comfort. It lives in family systems where being strong meant never breaking down. It lives in relationships where vulnerability became ammunition, where showing hurt meant inviting more. It lives in a culture that treats sadness like failure, like something to overcome quickly, like something to be ashamed of. The retreat into the cave isn't rejection. It isn't weakness. It isn't a choice made against the people who love them. It is protection. It is preservation. It is the last defense of a self that feels too fragile to survive exposure. Today, we step into that cave. We learn its geography. We understand its necessity. And perhaps in understanding, we learn how to sit at its entrance with patient love, waiting for the moment when the door can open again. Before we judge this retreat, before we call it avoidance or self-sabotage or unhealthy coping, we must first understand what it is. This is not rebellion. This is not stubbornness. This is not someone choosing isolation over connection out of spite or indifference. This is something far more fundamental, something that bypasses conscious decision-making entirely and speaks directly from the body's oldest wisdom. Watch what happens in the natural world when an animal is injured. A deer struck by a car doesn't limp into the open meadow seeking help from the herd. A wolf with a wounded leg doesn't howl for the pack to gather around and witness its pain. Instead, it finds the thickest underbrush, the darkest hollow, the most hidden corner of the forest. It lies down there alone and waits. It doesn't emerge until the wound has closed, until strength has returned, until vulnerability no longer makes it prey. This isn't antisocial behavior. This is survival architecture built into bone and blood over millennia of evolution. Injury makes an animal visible to predators. Weakness attracts danger. The instinct to hide when hurt isn't pathology, it's protection, refined by countless generations into something automatic, something that doesn't require thought. Human beings, for all our complexity, for all our language and culture and consciousness, still carry this programming. The cave we retreat to when we're sad isn't so different from the hollow tree or the hidden burrow. Our sadness is the wound. The world outside is full of predators, not lions and wolves, but judgment, expectation, the exhausting performance of being okay. When our emotional skin has been stripped away, when everything hurts to touch, the instinct rises up from somewhere beneath thought. Find shelter, go dark, disappear until you're strong enough to be seen again. This is restorative retreat. This is vulnerability seclusion. This is the body's ancient knowledge overriding the mind's social obligations. And there is nothing wrong with it, not inherently. The person who vanishes into their apartment, who stops answering messages, who withdraws from all social contact, isn't being cruel. They are being an injured creature, following an instinct older than civilization, older than language, older than the concept of friendship itself. They are not hiding from you. They are hiding from their own fragility in a world that feels dangerous to the wounded. Every text message is a spotlight. Every phone call is an interrogation they don't have energy to endure. Every social gathering is a stage where they must perform wellness. They don't feel where they must explain what cannot be explained, where they must hold their broken pieces together with trembling hands while everyone watches. So they choose the cave. They choose the darkness, where no one can see how badly they're bleeding. They choose silence, where no one can hear them cry. They choose solitude, where no one can witness the ugly, ungraceful work of trying to put themselves back together. And here is what must be understood. This isn't about trust. The person they're hiding from might be their closest friend, their most loving partner, their gentlest family member. It doesn't matter. The instinct doesn't discriminate. When the wound is deep enough, when the pain is overwhelming enough, the body says hide and everything else falls away. Logic doesn't enter the equation. Social bonds don't override the signal. The rational mind that knows their loved ones want to help cannot shout louder than the ancient voice that says exposure equals death. This is why the disappearance feels so sudden, so complete, so impossible to penetrate. One day they're fine laughing at dinner, responding to texts present in the world. The next day they're gone, and no amount of reaching out seems to bridge the distance. It's not because they stopped caring. It's because something older than caring has taken control, something that operates on a frequency below words, below relationship, below everything except the simple biological imperative to survive. The wounded animal finds its cave and lies down in the dark. It doesn't emerge for food or water or companionship until the danger of exposure has passed. This is what you're witnessing when someone you love goes silent. Not abandonment, not rejection, just an injured creature following instructions written in its DNA, seeking the only safety it knows how to find. But instinct alone doesn't explain why some people retreat into caves while others reach for hands. Biology provides the foundation, but experience builds the walls. Somewhere in the architecture of their past, they learn specific lessons about what sadness means and what it costs. They learn that the cave isn't just safer than the open world. It's the only place where survival is possible. These lessons weren't taught through words. They were taught through repetition, through pattern, through the thousand small moments that shape a nervous system's understanding of danger and safety. The first lesson arrives in childhood in the ordinary moments that feel too small to matter. A child comes home crying, face wet with tears, over something that feels enormous in their small world. The parent looks up from the dishes, from the bills, from the weight of their own exhaustion, and something crosses their face. Not cruelty exactly. Just tiredness, just overwhelm. Not now, sweetheart. Mommy's too tired for this. Or perhaps the parent grows anxious, their own distress rising to meet the child's tears, creating a feedback loop where the child's sadness becomes the parent's emergency. Stop crying, you're fine. There's nothing to cry about. The child learns something that will live in their body long after the memory fades. They learn that their sadness is a burden, that it takes something from the people they love, that it transforms their parent's face from warm to cold, from open to closed. So they begin to hide it. They cry in their bedroom with the door shut. They smile through the hurt. They become very, very good at appearing fine. And when they grow up, when sadness arrives in their adult life, they don't reach for their friends or partners. Instead, they protect them the only way they know how, by disappearing until the burden has lifted, until they can return wearing the face that doesn't cost anyone anything. For others, the lesson has a different shape. They grew up as the strong one, the capable one, the one everyone leaned on when things fell apart. Maybe they were the oldest child in a chaotic family. Maybe they had a parent who was fragile, unreliable, always falling apart, and someone had to hold everything together. That someone became them. They learned early that their role wasn't to need it, was to provide. Their identity crystallized around this function. They became the rock, the foundation, the one who never breaks. Sadness threatens this entire structure. If they're sad, if they're struggling, if they're the one who needs help, then who holds everything up? The terror isn't just about their own vulnerability, it's about the entire system collapsing. So when sadness comes, they retreat not to feel it, but to fight it alone, to wrestle it into submission in private, to emerge only when they've restored themselves to the role everyone needs them to play. The cave becomes a workshop where they frantically repair the mask before anyone sees it's cracked. Then there are those who learned an even harsher lesson. They learned that vulnerability doesn't just burden, it betrays. That showing sadness invites cruelty instead of comfort. Maybe they cried in front of someone who mocked them for it. Maybe they confessed their pain to someone who later used it as a weapon, throwing their own hurt back at them during an argument. Maybe they grew up in an environment where any display of weakness made them a target, where siblings or classmates or even parents saw tears as an opportunity for ridicule or domination. Trust broke somewhere along the way. Not completely, perhaps they can still laugh with friends, still share good news, still participate in the light parts of life. But the dark parts, the wounded parts, those they guard with fierce protectiveness. The cave isn't just shelter, it's a fortress. They've learned that showing the wound invites someone to press on it, that vulnerability is an invitation for more pain. So they lock themselves away, not because they don't want comfort, but because comfort has proven too dangerous to risk. There are others still who retreat for different reasons entirely. They are the ones who feel everything too deeply, whose nervous systems never learn to filter the world's emotional static. They are empaths, highly sensitive people, whose sadness doesn't arrive alone, but brings with it the weight of everything they sense around them. When they're sad, they don't just process their own grief, they absorb the anxiety of everyone who worries about them, the discomfort of those who don't know what to say, the helplessness of those who want to fix what can't be fixed. Being around people when they're sad creates an unbearable noise. Every well-meaning question feels like static. Every concerned face adds another frequency to the chaos. They can't hear their own pain through all the emotional interference. The only way to understand what they're feeling is to eliminate every other signal, to retreat into silence so complete that they can finally distinguish their own heartbeat from the noise. Solitude isn't rejection, it's the only way to hear themselves think, the only way to know what's theirs and what they've absorbed from the world around them. And then there's the shame, the quiet, corrosive shame of still being sad when you should be over it already. We live in a culture that treats sadness like a task, to complete a problem, to solve a temporary state that productive people move through efficiently. Take a mental health day, practice self-care, get back out there. The unspoken message is clear: sadness that lingers is personal failure. Happiness is something you owe the world, and if you can't deliver it, you should at least have the decency to suffer privately. So they hide in the cave until they're fixed, until they can emerge wearing the face that proves they've done the work, that they're trying hard enough, that they're not one of those people who wallows or gives up or stays. Broken too long. The cave becomes a waiting room where they sit in the dark until they're presentable again. Here is where the story turns, where the cave that promised safety begins to shift into something else. The retreat that felt like protection that followed instinct as ancient as bone begins to calcify into something more permanent, more painful. What started as temporary shelter becomes a prison with walls built from the inside. At first, the cave delivers what it promised. The darkness soothes. The silence feels like relief. Away from eyes that might judge and voices that might demand, they can finally let themselves fall apart without performance or apology. They can cry without explanation. They can exist in their pain without having to translate it into words that make sense to anyone else. The relief is real. The rest is necessary. But sadness doesn't heal on a schedule. Days stretch into weeks. The messages from friends slow down, then stop. People respect the boundaries they've set. giving them the space they seem to need, and that space grows wider until it becomes an ocean they don't know how to cross. Inside the cave, surrounded by silence, they chose a new feeling begins to grow. Not just sadness anymore, but something lonelier. Something that whispers they were right all along. No one really understands. No one can help. They truly are alone in this. The cave that was meant to protect them from the world begins to protect them from connection itself. Every day spent inside makes the outside world feel stranger, more threatening, harder to return to. They imagine trying to explain where they've been, what they've been feeling, why they disappeared, and the words feel impossible. Too much time has passed. The gap is too wide. How do you walk back into someone's life after vanishing without explanation? How do you say, "I'm sorry I disappeared," when you can barely articulate why you needed to, so they stay? Not because the cave still feels safe, but because leaving feels impossible. The protection has inverted. They're no longer hiding from the world's judgment. They're hiding from their own shame about how long they've been hiding. The walls that were supposed to be temporary have become permanent, and they've forgotten how to take them down. This is the paradox that lives at the heart of protective isolation. The very act that was supposed to help them heal begins to deepen the wound. They feel sad, so they hide. Hiding makes them feel alone. Feeling alone makes them sadder. Feeling sadder makes them hide more. The cycle tightens, spiral turning into spiral, until they can no longer remember which came first, the sadness or the solitude. There is a difference that matters here, a distinction that determines whether the cave becomes sanctuary or tomb. Solitude is a choice made from fullness, a conscious decision to step away from the world's noise, to hear yourself think, to rest, to refill the well that social interaction empties. Solitude is the writer in their cabin, the meditator on their cushion, the artist in their studio. It is peaceful. It is restorative. It is a door you walk through knowing you can walk back out whenever you choose. Isolation is different. Isolation is what happens when the door won't open from the inside anymore. It's the feeling of being cut off, not by choice, but by necessity, by shame, by fear, by the accumulated weight of all the reasons you learned that being alone is safer than being seen. Isolation doesn't restore, it depletes. It doesn't bring peace, it brings a specific kind of suffering that feels like being the last person left alive in a world that has moved on without you. The person who retreats to their cave seeking solitude often ends up in isolation instead. They wanted rest but found abandonment. They wanted quiet but found the deafening silence of a phone that no longer rings. They wanted time to heal but discovered that wounds don't close in darkness, they fester. That healing doesn't happen in isolation, it happens in the careful, painful, courageous act of letting someone witness the wound without running away. Inside the cave, they begin to understand something that terrifies them. The very strategy that was supposed to keep them safe is slowly destroying them. The walls they built to protect their fragility are making them more fragile. The isolation that felt like survival is beginning to feel like slow suffocation. They need to open the door, but they've forgotten how. They've been alone so long that connection itself has become foreign, frightening, a skill they're no longer sure they possess. The question becomes not whether to open the door, but how. How do you emerge from a cave you've lived in so long it feels like home? How do you reach out after weeks or months of silence? How do you bridge a gap you created for protection but now can't cross? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't the same for everyone. But it begins with understanding that opening the door doesn't mean tearing down the walls. It means learning to crack it open just enough to let a single beam of light through. If you are the one inside the cave, the first act of courage isn't reaching out. It's naming what lives inside you. The weight pressing on your chest isn't just sadness. Sadness is too broad, too vague a word that could mean anything or nothing. Get more specific. Give the feeling its true name. Are you disappointed, betrayed, exhausted, ashamed, overwhelmed, grieving, something you can't get back? The act of naming doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it does something else. It makes it knowable. It transforms the formless dark into something with edges, something you can hold in your hands and examine in the light. When you can name it even just to yourself, you've taken the first step toward making it shareable. You don't need to explain the whole story. You don't need to justify why you feel this way or prove that your pain is legitimate. You just need one true sentence that acknowledges the reality of what you're experiencing. I'm overwhelmed and I don't know how to get back. I'm scared people are angry with me for disappearing. I'm exhausted from pretending I'm okay. One sentence. That's all it takes to begin. The second act of courage is sending a signal, not an explanation, not an apology, not a full accounting of where you've been and why. Just a small message that says, I'm still here, I'm not okay, and it's not your fault. You can send this to one person. Someone who has earned your trust through patience, through consistency, through the kind of love that doesn't demand immediate returns. The message can be simple. Hey, I've been going through something and needed to be alone. I'm sorry I've been quiet. It's not about you. I just needed space. This message does two things at once. It honors your need for the cave, while acknowledging that your silence has created worry, confusion, perhaps hurt. It's a way of saying, I see you standing outside, and I need you to know I haven't forgotten you're there. You're not inviting them in yet. You're not promising to be okay soon. You're just letting them know the door still exists, that you're still on the other side, that the silence isn't permanent. Then comes the hardest part, allowing someone to sit with you in the dark. Not to fix you, not to flood you with advice or optimism or solutions, just to exist beside you without needing you to be different than you are. This might look like inviting a trusted friend over with clear boundaries. Can you come watch a movie with me? I don't really want to talk about what's going on. I just need company that doesn't require anything from me. This is connection without performance, presence without pressure. It's learning that you can be broken in front of someone without having to explain the breaking. If you are the one standing outside the cave, your task is different but equally difficult. Your impulse is to help, to fix, to pull them out into the light where they'll be safe again. But that impulse, however, loving can feel like violence to someone who needs the dark right now. The door won't open if you're pounding on it. Your calls and messages, each one sent with care and worry, can accumulate into something that feels like siege instead of support. So you do something that feels counterintuitive. You step back, you give space, but you don't disappear entirely. You leave something at the threshold, a message that doesn't require response, a signal that says, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, and you don't owe me anything. Something like, thinking about you today. No need to reply. Just wanted you to know I'm around whenever you're ready. This is the lightest possible touch, a way of maintaining connection without applying pressure. You wait, not passively, not with resentment or impatience, but with the active patience that understands healing happens on its own timeline. You resist the urge to take their silence personally, to turn their withdrawal into evidence that they don't care about you or that you did something wrong. Their cave isn't about you. Their need for darkness doesn't diminish what you mean to them. It just means they're injured, and injured creatures hide. When they finally crack the door open, when they send that first tentative message after weeks of silence, you don't flood them with relief or questions or gentle reproach about how worried you've been. You meet them where they are. You say something simple. Good to hear from you. I'm here. You let them control the pace of re-entry. You don't demand explanations or apologies or promises that they won't disappear again. You just create a space safe enough that they might risk stepping into it. This is how bridges get built across silence, not through grand gestures or forced interventions, but through small acts of courage on both sides. The person in the cave learning to crack the door, the person outside learning to wait at the threshold without demanding entry, both trusting that connection can survive separation, that love doesn't require constant presence, that some doors need to open slowly or they won't open at all. We have been taught to misunderstand strength. We've been sold a version of it that looks like invulnerability, like never breaking, like carrying everything alone without complaint or visible struggle. We've learned that strong people don't cry, don't need help, don't retreat into caves when the world becomes too much. We've learned that asking for support is weakness, that showing wounds is failure, that the measure of a person is how quickly they bounce back from pain. But this definition of strength is a lie that makes us smaller, lonelier, more brittle than we need to be. Real strength isn't the absence of caves. It isn't pushing through sadness with gritted teeth and forced smiles. It isn't pretending you're fine when you're falling apart, isn't carrying weights that should be shared, isn't suffering in silence to spare others the burden of your humanity. Real strength is knowing when you need the cave. It's honoring the instinct that says, retreat, rest, protect yourself from exposure when you're too wounded to stand in the light. There is profound courage in admitting you can't do it alone right now, that you need darkness and quiet, that you need to disappear for a while. But real strength is also knowing when the cave has become a prison. It's recognizing when protection has curdled into isolation, when the walls you built for safety are now keeping out the very connection that could help you heal. It's finding the courage to crack open the door, even when opening. It feels impossible, even when you're terrified of what you'll find on the other side, even when every instinct screams that exposure equals danger. And perhaps most importantly, real strength is letting someone sit with you in the dark. The cave was the only safe place you knew. For weeks or months or years, it sheltered you from a world that felt too bright, too loud, too demanding of a wellness you couldn't manufacture. The walls kept out judgment and expectation, and the exhausting performance of being okay. You survived because of those walls. You honor them by acknowledging what they gave you. But healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the sacred, terrifying space of allowing another person to witness your pain without trying to fix it, without needing you to explain it, without requiring you to be anyone other than exactly who you are in this moment. It happens when someone sits beside you in the darkness, not with a floodlight trying to chase the shadows away, but with a single candle. Just enough light to remind you that you're not alone. Just enough warmth to make the dark feel less cold. Their presence doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't solve the problem or answer the questions or restore what was lost. But it does something else, something more important. It says your wound doesn't make you unlovable. Your sadness doesn't make you a burden. Your need for the cave doesn't make you weak. You can be broken in front of me and I won't run away. You can be honest about your pain and I won't use it against you. You can take all the time you need and I'll still be here. This is coexistence. This is the kind of love that doesn't demand recovery on a schedule, that doesn't confuse presence with pressure, that understands some wounds need witness more than solutions. Your cave will always be part of you. You don't outgrow the need for shelter, for darkness, for the occasional retreat from a world that asks too much. The journey isn't to demolish the cave or pretend you don't need it anymore. The journey is learning to trust that even in your deepest darkness, even in your most profound vulnerability, there are people who love you enough to wait at the threshold. Not with demands or expectations or timelines, just with a small light, a patient heart, and the quiet promise that when you're ready, when the door finally opens, they'll still be there. You are not alone in the cave. You never were.